Hello, everybody. I really look forward to reading your argumentative essays. If you have not turned in those essays, remember that they are due tonight by midnight. In addition to that, I'm sorry about the backlog on your weekly activities. I'll have grades on those ready for you by Monday. Otherwise, I hope you all are getting ready for a great Thanksgiving break. In the meantime, we've got a little bit more ground to cover, so let's talk about fallacy claims. So fallacies are probably one of my favorite chapters to talk about. And the best way to think about fallacy claims is that there are arguments gone wrong. And we see fallacy claims all of the time when people make arguments that just don't have good evidence, when people are making comparisons that just don't fit, right? So there are so many great examples of fallacies in action. One of my favorites is a U.S. senator who kind of comes into Congress and he says, hey, I found this snowball on Capitol Hill. So when people are saying that there's global warming, that's not true because there was snow outside. Here's the snowball, right? That is an example of a fallacy because it suggests that something is true, right? That global warming is not real because of an instance of snow at Capitol Hill that doesn't represent the overall global climate situation in the US at all, or abroad, right? So let's talk about what fallacy claims are. So fallacy claims are arguments that need to be rejected because they violate a major component or part of argumentation. So everything that we've talked about, including the Tolman model about what makes good arguments, is somehow missing or not there when it comes to fallacy claims. And there are a lot of different examples of fallacy claims in action. So for instance, one of the most common ones is ad hominem, so attacking the person, the credibility of the person, rather than the arguments that they make. So fallacy claims are really common in debate and argumentation, and so being able to identify and refute fallacy claims using the refutation strategies that we've talked about last chapter is a really helpful thing to kind of analyze. So in some way, right, like fallacy claims violate some form of logic. So the textbook talks about like, for instance, using the syllogism incorrectly. So Japanese eat raw fish, sharks eat raw fish, therefore Japanese are sharks is an example of that in action, right? Like you're reaching a conclusion based off of premises that don't fit together. So additionally, one important thing about fallacy claims is that they're eliminating the idea of sophistry, right? So sophistry is like the idea of making arguments, even if those arguments aren't true. It's just making arguments for the sake of arguments. So that's sort of what you're trying to eliminate by refuting fallacy claims. So again, one of the major forms of fallacy claims are tu quoque, or responding to a charge with countercharge. One of my favorite examples of that is if you've ever seen like the classic Looney Tunes cartoons where it's Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, they're arguing over whether or not it's duck season or rabbit season because they want it to be the season that they don't get hunted in, right? So what they do is they just yell at each other. They're like, duck season, rabbit season, duck season, rabbit season. There's no substantive discussion or argument between the two. They're just making like claims and arguing at each other, rather than supporting those in any way. So another better example of that is no you, right? Like it's like somebody says you're ugly and then you respond by saying no, you're ugly, right? And responding to a charge with countercharge or tu quoque is problematic because it doesn't investigate the argument that somebody's making. It just presents a different argument. Additionally, you have begging the question. And so begging the question is where you're assuming something is true or you're using that as a starting point for argumentation, even though it's probably not true at all. So you could say, for instance, look, we all agree that the earth is flat. So what do we need to do about that? Like that starts with a faulty premise and assumes that that faulty premise is a valid starting point. And we see this all of the time, right? Controlling the starting points of argumentation and what we assume to be true has a big effect on how arguments might be persuasive. Additionally, we have what's called a fallacious appeal to authority. So using credibility and credibility from authority figures is great, but it becomes a fallacy when the entire argument is based off of their credibility, right? Like you're not making any sort of argument about why that person is credible. You just say, because that credible person says it, it must be true. And I mean, we see this all of the time, right? Like where the credibility of the person does not make a substantive argument. A good example of this is in 1998, this man named Andrew Wakefield published a study in which he suggested that there was a link between measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines and autism. There was no link, and his study was fraudulent and drew from incorrect data and had just tons of problems. But by just using his credibility to say, hey, he's correct, therefore vaccines cause autism, people engaged in that fallacy. So that's an example of where that fallacy might be a problem. Another big fallacy is appeals to popularity. So appeals to popularity are, because the majority of people think this, it must be true, right? So there are a lot of examples about this. Like there's a high quantity of people who believe, for instance, that we dedicate about 15% of our budget to like foreign international aid, when in reality we actually spend less than 1% of our budget on it. So just because a large amount of people believe something is true doesn't mean it's true. And the fallacy comes in if you start to conclude that something is true just because people will say that, right? Lemmings walking off a cliff. Another thing is a post hoc fallacy. And the post hoc assumes that just because two things are kind of in the same time and space, that one thing actually causes another. So you might have heard, for instance, in quantitative work, correlation does not mean causation. So, for instance, one of my favorites is this chart that says that mayonnaise consumption, so the more people eat mayonnaise, is correlated to more ski deaths. However, right, there's no causal relationship, as far as I know anyway. Like eating mayonnaise doesn't cause you to die while skiing. But those two things are correlated with each other, right? Like there's the numbers of those are similar between years. Correlation doesn't mean causation. And so one of the limits of scientific and quantitative data that you might draw from when you're using your research in your argumentative essay and refutation block is just because two things are related doesn't mean one thing causes another when you're using things like quantitative methods. Additionally, right, there's fallacies in language. So maybe somebody is using words incorrectly, or there's different interpretations of words. But the next big fallacy that gets talked about is ad hominem. So like I mentioned earlier, ad hominem is attacking the credibility of the person in lieu of actually making an argument. So that's not to say that the credibility of the person isn't important, but one of the criticisms, for instance, of Clinton during the 2016 campaign was that she made several kind of ad hominem attacks, right? Went after Trump's credibility in a lot of instances, but didn't necessarily interrogate the logic of the arguments that he was making. And that was seen as one of the more unsuccessful elements of her campaign. So ad hominem attacks are oftentimes not very effective strategies and don't really get at the arguments that somebody is trying to make, whether or not those arguments are good or bad, right? And additionally, you have, for instance, verbal aggression. So in addition to attacking the credibility of the person, right, like doing personal attacks, doing name calling, that sort of thing feeds into the fallacy as well of ad hominem. Additionally, you have appeal to pity. And so, right, eliciting emotions and doing emotional appeals is fine, but appealing to pity is just making somebody feel bad as the argument. One of my favorite examples of this is if you've ever seen on TV those commercials that are that play really sad music, and they're for like pets up for adoption, and then they've got like the black and white videos, and it's really sad, right? But oftentimes those videos are just including that information and appealing to our sense of pity rather than actually making an argument as to why, for instance, pet adoption is a good thing. Like the pity alone is enough to make that something we should believe, and therefore it's using that fallacy. So in addition to that, there are a few other things that are talked about. So for instance, the pragma dialectical approach. So this is about how there's like various rules, as well as what people kind of say and mean in argumentation. So this sort of approach establishes certain parameters for what types of argumentation and claims are acceptable or not acceptable. So for instance, things like fallacies might not fit under that framework. Additionally, we see that there are deceptive claims, right? So deception is about there is an intention to deceive. So one really good example for this is drones in the US and the accuracy of the use of drones or unpersoned aerial vehicles. It's really interesting to note that drones and their accuracy, so a target, right, might constitute somebody who's actually like deemed a terrorist. However, that definition has been expanded to include all military-age males in regions where drone attacks happen. So deception is used by the US government to increase the accuracy of drones and like how that number is cited because innocent people who fit, like being military-age males, follow the definition of a terrorist that the US establishes. So that's an example of deception. Another thing is refusal to reason, right? So if you were a kid and you ever threw like a temper tantrum or just didn't come to the table or didn't discuss something, right, like ran up to your room, that's an example of refusal to reason. It's, this is true, I believe this, I'm not going to do any sort of argumentation or like disbelieve anything that I say. So you're not coming to the table, right? And so also, right, like you're not engaging in cooperation. You're refusing to participate in the conversation. That's another example, right? Obfuscation is fallacy that involves making something as complicated as possible in order to get somebody to believe it, right? So according to this study by such and such that was peer-reviewed and studied, right, like when there's so many layers and boundaries in terms of how arguments are being made, that lack of clarity makes somebody be like, forget it. I'm just going to believe you. Like, right? Like the layers of that is used to make arguments seem compelling when they're not. The devil's in the details. Additionally, the quantity maxim, right? So the quantity maxim is like saying what's appropriate for argumentation and, for instance, preventing things like violating conflicts of interest. Right, so some examples for that, right, like if you are trying to publish a study on the most ethical companies and you as a company are sponsoring that study and wow, hey, you showed up as one of the most ethical companies, right, like that's a conflict of interest there and probably means that you're not so ethical after all. So those are kind of examples of what those fallacies look like. Reckless disregard for the truth. So that's when you're just interested in like moving forward without even regarding what's true, right? So like maybe somebody's like, hey, I have evidence in this case that shows why like your claims aren't correct. And you're like, I don't care. I just need to get this case forward. So rather than like intentionally trying to deceive, it just means that you don't have interest in or you aren't engaging in the truth of various arguments. So given all of these fallacies that the textbook talks about, refuting fallacies follows that four-step process that we talked about in the previous chapter. The first step involves identifying what the fallacy claim is. So, for instance, right, they said that I was stupid. Next, you kind of identify what the fallacy is, right? I say that this is a fallacy of an ad hominem attack. The third step is supporting how that's a fallacy claim, right? So an ad hominem attack involves attacking the person's credibility rather than the arguments that they make. And that undermines the ability to reach good argumentation and doesn't allow us to actually discuss what the person is talking about. Therefore, fourth step is talking about how that undermines the ultimate position that's being made. Therefore, we should reject the fallacy claim and actually investigate what it is that my argument is trying to say. So by identifying and refuting fallacy claims, and there are a lot of fallacy claims in the world, you can better address where the argumentative limits come in and just what's missing from argumentation, right? When you correctly identify fallacy claims, that really hurts the credibility of your opponent and helps you to determine, what's missing from their as well as potentially your own arguments. So avoiding these fallacy claims and following the things that we've talked about what makes good argumentation is really, really important. There are a lot of funny and really good examples of fallacy claims out in the world. So looking at and I think identifying wow, this is an ad hominem fallacy, this is a tu quoque fallacy, will be helpful as you start thinking about how argumentation happens in the world. Have a great weekend, everybody, and let me know if you have any questions.